welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin, and this is the show where you can get your property related questions answered by a team of experts. And today we've got a French slant on the programme. We're specialising in the areas in France that are very popular at the moment, and in particular with one of our guests with looking at Bordeaux, which again is a very popular area now. So welcome to the show to Joanna Leggett, co-founder of Leggett Immobilier. Welcome to you, Joanna.
Thanks, Stephen.
Nice to have you back. And your colleague, area manager for the Bordeaux area, is Brad Turner. Welcome, Brad.
Thanks for having us.
Your first time on the show, so we'll try and be gentle. Okay. All right. So, Joanna, I think we'll start with you. And the first question is this. I'm considering buying a retirement home in France, but have become a little overwhelmed by first the sheer size of France, and then secondly, the volume of properties available. I also understand that currently the French property market is pretty fast moving. How would the experts suggest I initially commence my search and further expedite things quickly before properties are sold, before I can even view them? Well, I wish we'd got that here, Joanne.
There's a lot of questions in one there. To start off with, I think particularly for retirement, the location is going to be the most important thing. I would always, if you're retiring, I'd always pick a city, and then if you want to be in the countryside, draw a half-an-hour circle around a city, because you've got to think of things like hospitals, for example, or city, if you need to get into cities for transport, etc., etc. I don't know whether the viewer has been to France before, but yes, it is the biggest country in Western Europe, and the properties vary in price, architecture, the price of the properties especially, depending on where you are. So I think budget and location is going to be the things that you need to look at first. France is an absolutely amazing place to retire to, because it's really, unless you're in the cities, it's more about lifestyle and more about the community. And I found living there in the last 18 years that people have time for each other, and it's really nice. So from a retirement point of view, it's a beautiful place to go. So I would make sure that you have amenities nearby. I wouldn't go too rural and too isolated, because obviously if you're going to be living there permanently and not working, you want to be part of a working community as such. I'd always try and visit in the winter months when you're looking for a property, because if you love it between October and April, you're going to absolutely love it in the summer. Isn't that right, Brad?
I agree.
And if you're going to be there permanently, you want to check out in the winter, because there are a lot of tourist towns. There's one near me, for example, in Branton, which is beautiful in the summer, and it's, all the restaurants are open and there's boats going up and down the river. And then come winter, there's maybe one restaurant open and everything's very quiet. And if you're living there all the time, you want to be part of a community, have lots of friends, make new friends. It's quite national. You'll have Brits, expat Brits, you'll have Americans, lots of Americans at the moment as well. You have Dutch, Belgians, French, neighbours. So you'll experience different ways of life. But I would say that it is a lovely place to live. And when you do retire, they go to every event that you're invited to, possibly by your local mayor, because that will get you to know all the local people. When making a search, obviously look online. You can have a look at the website, look at the properties, look at the areas. There'll be a perfect house in every area, but it really depends on what your needs are. So I'd start with making a list of that. You can talk to people like ourselves, and we'll help you match the criteria for your needs, what you need, what your budget will allow. Weather can vary across France. You might want to be in slightly cooler and not too hot. You may want to be on train lines and flight paths, etc., so that you can get backwards and forwards to the UK if that's what they're looking to do. But initially, you can send us in your criteria, and we'll listen and have a look at that and try and match some properties and suggest locations that we think would be suitable.
Okay, Joanna, we've known you a long time on Property TV, and we know you run a very high quality business and act with great integrity. If one looks online at other agents, shall we say, in the UK we're protected by something called the Property Misdescriptions Act in terms of describing the property and being fairly truthful about what it is and what it represents. Are there any such regulations in France? Is it quite tightly controlled?
It's very tightly controlled. In fact, in France, you have to have a license to become an estate agent, an immobilier, as we're known, which you don't have to have in the UK. So anybody could open up an estate agency. And with those regulations, there are a lot of regulations which come with misdescriptions and things like that. And, everything is looked into. Even in advertising, we have to have certain things like the DPE report, which is the energy report, has to be shown.
Yeah.
Fees have to be shown. Everything. It's very, very strict. And it's a very, very safe place to buy, a very safe country to buy for the buyer, because the buyer is protected all the way through the sales process, right from the start, all the way through to completion. And agents in France do a lot more than I would say would have done in the UK, whereby, I've even got children into schools, and taken them to meet the local mayor, taken them to see the classrooms. I've taken people with health issues to see a doctor to see if their medications are available. So it's a much more of a hand-holding service, I think, that what we offer in France. And of course, there's also the language barrier, particularly with Brits. A lot of Brits don't speak French, some do, which is great, but those that don't, we help with the translation as well. But it is very, very regulated and very, very safe, very, very safe country to buy.
Okay, well, Joanna, comprehensive answer as always. Thank you so much for that. Brad, your first question. Bordeaux is an area of France I have considered moving to and would like to have the panel's view on the comparison to other regions of France that Bordeaux has, both in terms of initial house prices and then the cost of living moving on from there.
It's a great question. I think one of the reasons that people are drawn to Bordeaux is because it has the cosmopolitan aspect to it without having all the headache and traffic that you're going to find in some of the more major metropolitan cities. I guess the comparison would be to Paris. Access is 2 hours via fast rail, and that's driven up the interest in Bordeaux. So of late, at least for the last 6-7 years, it's been pretty much the #1 city for people from France to migrate to.
Okay.
We have close beach access. The mountains aren't very far. The city itself offers all the amenities that you'd expect from a larger city. So we have theater, we have opera, we have obviously all the concert venues you could need, and the schools are excellent.
It's the comparison between city life and sort of rural life. Is the transition quite gentle in terms of area? I mean, is it that you go out of the city and sort of drop off the end of a cliff, or is it a nice gentle sweep out to sort of rural?
So you don't have the urban sprawl, which I think is great, but you can get out of the city very quickly, either by bike, by public transportation, or clearly by car. In fact, there are so many parks and green spaces around Bordeaux. It's actually really easy to find yourself outside of an urban setting in a very short period of time. So families love it. Accessibility by light rail is actually getting better and better. And so we're seeing more and more people interested in living in sort of the areas around Bordeaux where now they can access it more readily. And because of the fact that people are working from home even more frequently, that gives them a little bit more leeway to not have to worry about such a big commute every day.
Yeah. I think it's a very important factor if you are retiring, for instance, not to put yourself in a rural area that's a bit remote, difficult to commute into a city if you haven't got a car.
Absolutely.
I mean, it's quite an important factor, isn't it? I don't know whether you find many people sort of overlook that point when they come looking, but it sounds like Bordeaux is an ideal sort of compromise. You've got access to the city, but ease of access to the rural aspects of the attraction of living in France. Sounds good.
Agreed.
Okay, good. Okay, Joanna, have you got anything to add to that?
Well, what he did forget to mention is the City du Vin is there. Very important for wine tasters.
Oh, right, okay.
Yes, it's a very big wine region, Bordeaux, and they do have a whole city where you can go and do some wine tasting and buy some very nice bottles of rouge.
Right. Okay, well, as you say, an important error there, missing that out. But no, that sounds very interesting. And going back to the first question, for instance, I do sympathise with people when suddenly, you've got an idea in your head, let's go to France, the lifestyle looks fantastic. But which lifestyle? which part? You know, I mean, we've done some amazing programs with Joanna in the past about sort of verbally touring France, haven't we? And it's such a diverse country, isn't it, in terms of what you can get?
It is. I mean, I think Bordeaux, because of the location southwest of France, like I mentioned before, you know, the actual access to the beach is available on train, so you can go out direct. It takes about 40 minutes by train. And then if you want to go south and you want to be near the mountains, that's doable as well. But also what's important is to realize that we're so well located as far as the climate's concerned that it never gets too hot. Every once in a while you'll get a little bit of a heat wave, and it never gets too cold.
Right.
So we don't see snow.
In terms of temperature difference between, say, Bordeaux and the UK, would it be 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 degrees more?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm probably an hour north of Bordeaux, and you know, we're reaching 35, 40, which is extremely hot, but usually around the 30, which would be similar to Bordeaux, which will always be a lot higher than it is in the UK. And I think because we have the Gulf Stream coming in around that sort of southwestern parts of France, sometimes we're actually even hotter than the south of France in the Côte d'Azur areas. So yeah, it's a great area and it's completely been rejuvenated. It is stunning. I can be in Bordeaux in half an hour on the train. But the great thing about Bordeaux is you know, it's a 4.5, 5 hour drive to Paris, but by train, you can do it with 2 hours. So you can just pop into Paris for the day.
Well, I think you've both done a great job there. Looks like we're all moving, doesn't it? Right, well, there we are. That's all we have time for in this half of the show. So join me again after the break when we'll be asking Joanna and Brad some more of your questions. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time with our French special today. So Joanna, your second question is this. Are the cost of living issues currently prevailing in France similar to the ones we're facing here in the UK, particularly relating to energy and food costs? I'm considering retiring to France, but don't want to jump out of the frying pan into the fire. Well, that's a good one.
Well, the difference is the property prices in France, depending on where you are in the UK, are a lot cheaper. And that makes a huge difference, particularly if you're retiring, because you know you might want more space, you might want more garden if you're retiring to grow vegetables or things like that you might not have got in the UK because space is limited. So that's one good thing, that you will be able to find a cheaper property, and particularly if you were coming from any London regions where it's extremely expensive, it's going to be, you know, less than half the price in France. However, the cost of living is probably the same. If you look at EDF's in France and the UK, so electricity costs, etc., are going to be very similar. But the French government are very, very good with eco, and they're very green. So, for example, for insulation, solar paneling, any types of things like that, you can. It's particularly if you're building new, you can actually get grants for. And they're subsidised quite heavily. So from that aspect, if you were looking at, you know, having something built for your retirement, then there are lots of opportunities there.
Can I just jump in there? Would those grants be available to a non-French citizen now?
Yeah, they're available to anybody who's going to become a resident in France, so which means you'll be paying your taxes and your income taxes in France. And if you are coming to retire to France, obviously you need to get into the healthcare system.
Sure.
As well. So all of those contribute. You'd have to apply for a carte séjour, which is your sort of permit to live there. But the cost of living, unfortunately, is probably going to be about the same. But the good news is you can have a lot more space and a lot bigger property than you would probably have in the UK. There's certain things like paint, for example, is much more expensive in France than it is in the UK. But then there's other things that will be a lot cheaper in France than what they will be in the UK. But what I would say is, you know, if you, again, as we talked about earlier in the programme, if you are coming to retire to France, it's a fantastic community-based area to come to.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned paint, which leads us to sort of renovations and things like that. Is it relatively easy to find sort of French contractors to do the sort of works you might need to do to make a place suitable for yourself? I mean, in some countries it is difficult. I mean,
I wouldn't say it's difficult. It's just that the good ones are generally busy, so you've got to plan in the amount of time, in advance to be able to get them. I would always use a registered builder, so that they're a registered artisan, as they're known in France. I'd always go local where possible. You can ask your agent. You could ask, you can go and have a look at some of the work. You can meet some of the clients of the artisans. The reason, a lot of Brits tend to bring builders over from the UK, and I wouldn't recommend that, even if they're friends and they're going to do it on the cheap, because if it's a holiday home, you're not going to be able to claim that back against capital gains tax when you come to sell it. The other thing is, say something goes wrong, are they going to be coming back from the UK to fix a small problem? Whereas if you're using local artisans, they're around the corner to be able to come back and fix any problems, but also it gets you into the community. You get to know more people. Generally speaking, like our stonemason does all of my neighbours. Our digger man does all of the neighbours, because we're currently having mains drains put in, so to connect to the house. And I think it's, there are, if you don't speak a word of French, there are lots of registered British artisans in France that, have perhaps moved over like I did 18 years ago and set up companies there. But it's very, very important, I would say, for insurance, to make sure that, the builders are fully insured. If they take out a wall and the building collapses or something like that, if they're insured and everything's regulated, then you'll be totally fine.
And again, presumably useful for guarantees for when you come to sell the property.
Exactly, because if you have a new roof put on, you need a 10-year guarantee. Now, this is where sometimes, roofers might come from the UK and do the roof themselves. But if they don't take out the insurance, the indemnity insurance, which they have to sell on, it's going to be very difficult to sell. So they do need to get that insurance, or buy that, insurance, so that when they do come to sell, if it's within 10 years, they do have the next buyer is covered by the roof. So again, if you're using artisans that are fully registered, particularly electricians, again, because they have to be signed off by EDF, to say that the work is done properly and there's no faults and there's no errors. That's why I would always say, go local, find your local artisans, you can inspect their work, fully insured, and then you'll be absolutely fine.
Okay. Do you concur with that, Brad?
I agree 100%. I think it's really important. And one of the things that we tell our clients is that they need to be looking out for that. If they're not familiar with navigating the system in France, then part of our service is to inform them about what they need to be looking out for. They may take it for granted here, and the French may take it for granted there, but it's important to be able to at least convey that information.
And those kind of issues that you can't put right once it's done.
Right.
That's
right.
That's the main thing, isn't it? Okay, Brad, we're going to move on to your second and final question. I'm moving to Bordeaux for work and will need to send my children to an international school. I'm undertaking a trip next month and wondered if you could recommend good areas to visit that would be suitable for families, but commutable to the city centres, which I think, as you previously described in answer, Bordeaux fits the bill, doesn't it?
Agreed, actually. And I think one of the reasons why it fits the bill is because there's almost 3 tiers of education that are available for the student. So foreign parents coming to Bordeaux may want to put their children directly into the French system because they feel it's the opportunity to immerse the children in the culture and the language. If that's not the case, there are schools that offer purely private education, almost following, if you will, the UK system, and we have a program like that there. And then there's the sort of intermediate program, which is partially subsidized by the government, still private, but offers a bilingual education. And then you actually have a couple programs that are purely public that offer a bilingual education as well. Those programs are oftentimes application programs, but any native speaking English youngster is going to be able to get into that program without much difficulty because there aren't that many people applying to the programs that are native English speaking.
Okay. I mean, is that peculiar to Bordeaux? Does that apply sort of nationwide in France?
I mean, I say that in the major metropolitan cities, Bordeaux included, Paris obviously, some of the other cities, for example, Marseille, Nice, those areas will have international programs that the students will have access to so they can get a bilingual education. Neighborhood-wise, if you're a family moving to a specific area, you will be in that school sector if it's a public school. If you apply to programs for your children that are outside of the school sector, that are private, there's no reason to be in the neighborhood. But generally speaking, within the confines of the actual ring road that's local in our area, you're going to be able to find a large number of schools that'll offer all those programs.
Okay. And I suppose the most obvious question there to ask as a sort of follow on is what is access like? Are they likely to be oversubscribed, as we often find the good schools are here in this country, or is access fairly easy to obtain?
It's a great question, and we see it a lot, especially with international clients. We have a lot of clients that come in that are mixed, if you will. So one may be purely French and the other one may be from another nation like the UK. And they're looking to put their kids in a school that's bilingual. So I would anticipate that my recommendation would be to do due diligence, look into the program, ask, get on some groups, Facebook, social media, to find out from other parents who've gone through it, and start doing your research early, because you're right, you do need to get on waiting lists in advance, especially at some of these programs. And so it's worth starting a year plus in advance in some cases. But that doesn't mean you can't come and live in the city, put your child in a program locally, give them that wonderful opportunity to learn the language, especially when they're young, because they're like sponges, and then move on to the next step, which is to go through the application process, get a feel for what neighborhood you like best, etc.
Okay, fine. Joanna, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with everything that Brad said. It depends on the age of the child as well. If they've been in a British education and they're in that curriculum already, so they're coming at 12 to 15, it might be better for them to carry on the British curriculum in, for example, the international school in Bordeaux does follow that curriculum, so they could just carry on with the GCSE system. However, if they're coming young, I agree with Brad, I'd put them in a local school, because they are like sponges. They'll pick up the language very, very quickly. They'll help the parents learn the language if they don't speak any French, but they'll also have local friends, because a lot of the time, if you're going to the international school, the children might need to board there if you're living outside and come home at weekends. But I will say one thing, the education system in France is superb. I think you probably agree with that, Brad. And, you know, the kids really are studious and they really love to study. And so all of the schools, particularly in Bordeaux, are very, very good. And in the countryside, you know, if you come out of Bordeaux, you might be working in Bordeaux, but your family's living in the countryside. Some of the schools just have 20 to 30 pupils in. So, you know, it can be a really, really good education for the children.
I'm not sure whether you're going to know the answer to this or not, because you'd need to know the comparisons. But I mean, is education fundamentally more expensive, or is it cheaper than in the UK, would you say, in terms of school fees?
I think personally it's probably less expensive. I think the more expensive option would be a purely private program, but the ones that are considered private by the term private, which is privé, are actually partially subsidized by the government. And there's a historic religious affiliation with those schools, but none of that carries through to today. So private schools offer programs. Obviously, you have to apply to them. There is high demand. They're clearly being, you know, looked at based on their results, where the students are getting into university programs and some of the higher level education programs. From personal experience, I had one child go through the system and he's done quite wonderfully, just finished, and is now at a very, very well-regarded university in Canada. So for me, it was a very straightforward option, because I knew that he was going to do well if he performed well, and they give you the opportunity to perform well. So
okay. Well, that's great. Well, look, I'm going to say a big thank you to both of you, to Joanna Leggett and Brad Turner from Leggett Immobilier. Thank you both for coming on the show. Very informative, as ever. Very professional. Thank you very much indeed. So that's all we've got time for today. So I look forward to seeing you next time on Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin. See you then.